Welcome to Zoom In, Zoom Out, your global look at news from Taiwan. I'm Rik Glauert. Now, it's been 3 decades since Taiwan started on taking its steps towards democracy, and it's now a place of massive social movements and political demonstrations. Most recently, the so-called Bluebird movement has been flocking across the island to protest several bills that were proposed and passed by a legislature now dominated by China-leaning lawmakers. It's the biggest protest in Taiwan since the 2014 Sunflower Movement, when hundreds of thousands of protesters rallied in Taipei to support student activists who were occupying the legislative building. Now, joining us today is independent journalist Brian Hioe, who was present at Sunflower and has been writing about Taiwan's social movements ever since. He's just published a novel called Taipei at Daybreak, a coming-of-age story of a Taiwanese American drawing upon Brian's own experiences from Occupy Wall Street to an attempt at breaking into Taipei's executive yuan. Brian, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So Brian, before we start talking about recent protests, let's zoom in on your book. It's a fictionalized account based on your experiences. But just so we're all clear, where does the fiction end and the reality begin? How much of this book is your story?
Yeah, so that's often a question I get because quite a lot is based on my life. Many characters are composites. They're not exactly one person. But the historical events are all real ones, and they are ones that I participated in. And so I think part of the attempt was to really capture this moment in time with the experiences I had in those years, because we live in a time more than a decade later now, and I think it's really worth remembering those times. And so it draws very heavily from my life.
And what does the book express? Could you just tell us a little bit about the story? What could we expect?
Yeah, absolutely. So it is a coming-of-age novel in some form, or maybe that's how I just package it as. But then it focuses on participation in social movements from a very young age. Occupy Wall Street in New York, the post-Fukushima anti-nuclear movement in Japan, and then the Sunflower movement. And so these series of social movements in the early 2010s, and what it was like to be a young person, as a young Asian American participating in those movements and being caught between different identities and navigating that, but also this kind of feeling of youthful rebellion and trying to find oneself in the midst of these large-scale protest movements that are often very tumultuous and chaotic.
The book has your first-person accounts of some of the big political moments over the last few years in Taiwan, but it also includes quite a lot of intimate relationships. Why did you want to include those two things alongside one another?
Yeah, I think in many ways the personal is the political, and a lot of the personal stories then feed into the politics that we see and hear about on the news. And so in regards to the Sunflower movement, it's all these individual micro-level stories. For example, something I did was I interviewed 100 Sunflower movement activists to document their oral histories. And it really got at that subjectivity of how and why they'd participated and took so many risks in movements. And so this was regarding my own experiences.
And quite a lot of the book is also set in New York and Tokyo. Why was it important for you to include those locations in the book alongside what happened in Taipei and Taiwan?
For one, I think it's because those were the first large-scale social movements that I cut my teeth on. In New York, in Occupy Wall Street in 2011, in Japan with the anti-nuclear demonstrations after the Fukushima disaster in 2012. But it's interesting too, because some of the other writing on Taiwan Sunflower movement that I've seen that is fiction also deals with this experience of experiencing and participating in transnational social movements. In those years, the Occupy movement had a very large impact on global social movements. That was also the time of the Arab Spring when you had these very social media-driven movements. And so I was also trying to capture that feeling of that moment, I think.
I noticed that emptiness is quite a recurring theme in the book. And the narrator talks about filling the void or this emptiness with political activism. Could you tell us a little bit about the relationship between activism and this feeling of emptiness for you?
Yeah, absolutely. I think part of it is a sense of emptiness or social isolation is something I think that pushed me into activism to begin with, from when I was a teenager, effectively. And I think in my experiences in social movements, large-scale ones such as Sunflower or Occupy Wall Street, or even smaller ones, you find a lot of people are out there trying to fill a void through activism. And I think that's a side of activism we don't always look at. It's often neglected, I think, in this more glamorized depiction of it, or the kind of triumphalist narrative of the Sunflower movement that we sometimes remember a decade later. I think that's, again, often the case, that people are actually driven by a sense of not only contempt for society, but for themselves. And I think people often forget in the years of the Sunflower movement how apocalyptic everything felt, how desperate people were, and the sense of outrage and disenfranchisement from young people that really pushed them to take risks because of the fact that they felt desperate in some sense. You look at a lot of the music, for example, produced around that time, a band like No Party for Cao Dong, and the lyrics are all about anger. And I think that is actually something else maybe this work reflects in some sense.
Yeah, so I actually wanted to take this moment to sort of zoom out and have a look at the present day. And we're in this space called Daybreak, which you created for your activism, for the work that you do. Could you tell us a bit more about the creation of this space and what are your ideals behind it? Do they represent any of the ideals that are in the book, or?
I think so. I think what's interesting is that, again, this book captures a moment in time, and some of the scenes are set in these various activist coffee shops. For example, Kafka on the Shore, the coffee shop that played indie music and was also an activist hangout, was one of the places we hung out in those years, and this table is actually from there. And so I think it's actually an attempt to really capture that moment in time, because there was a time in which there were many spaces like this, and there's no longer as many spaces that still exist today. And so when this started around 4 years ago, I think it was actually trying to recapture a moment that was fading already. I think young people, it's a space for them to politicize, but also find community. Now, the ones that have survived are usually concentrated around National Taiwan University, where there's a lot of students. And so having spaces that are not just by the campus town or the college town, I think is important. But I think it's a place for people to really find themselves in that sense.
As you mentioned, the book captures a moment in time 10 years ago. Could you tell us a bit about how Taiwan's politics has changed since then, and how has your work changed?
Absolutely. So things have changed a lot, even in the span of a short few years. For example, 2017, 2018, someone like Lin Feifan was still out there in the streets protesting, and now he's on the National Security Council. You have people that are government ministers now that are part of the Sunflower Movement. And that changed very, very quickly. And so I never expected to see this kind of shift towards electoral politics by many activists. And then people enter government and end up in pretty high positions. Other people have stayed in social movements, but the scene is not as large, it's not as active. And so that's definitely changed. There's not as much protests as there were a decade ago in the past 8 years under the Tsai administration and now under the Lai administration. And so with the Blue Bird movement more recently, we see a kind of resurgence for the first time in a decade.
You spent time at the Blue Bird protests, and obviously there was a lot of comparison between them and the Sunflower Movement. What were the differences you noticed?
It was a much younger movement in the sense that there are younger people that had not participated in the Sunflower Movement. But then in the backstage, it's all the same people, and the organizers are about the same. But the attempt was to make it the almost inverse of the Sunflower Movement, not an intense occupation of a legislature that is this act of storming and occupying a building for 23 days, and that occupation consumes so much resources and energy and creates so much burnout, but having a protest that people go to after work and they can go back home by 12 a.m. usually. So an attempt to preserve the energy of the movement for a later date, rather than to kind of expend it all within this month-long period of time. And so I think it's actually, in ways, reacting to this history. It's an echo of the Sunflower Movement, but attempting to do a different thing, which is also interesting because many of the people involved are, in fact, the same people.
So the book depicts your experiences of protest movements in New York, but also in Japan and Taiwan, and you flag a difference in the styles of protest, talking about the kind of disruptive, anarchic nature of Occupy in New York compared to kind of a more regulated or formal form of protest in Taiwan and Japan, where people might come and then leave at a certain hour and organizers just decide the parameters. Could you just tell us a little bit more about the different protest styles you've seen and whether you believe one or the other is more effective?
Yeah, absolutely. This is a thing I have a lot of thoughts on. As one of my other hats is, of course, as a researcher of social movements. And particularly, social movements worldwide have a tendency to performativity in some form, that, for example, playing for the cameras. But in Asia, it's often playing this civility. And that doesn't mean Asian protest movements are not more militant. I mean, we see 2019 in Hong Kong was very militant, for example. But there's often this emphasis on appealing to the public and cleaning up after yourself and coming off as good students. The role of students is considered very pure in many East Asian societies. And so this is often played up by the participants. Whereas in, let's say, Occupy Wall Street, it's very anarchic, it's a very horizontal decision-making process compared to how it is relatively top-down in the Sunflower Movement. But then there's a lot of bohemianism that is very much present there. For example, people that are smoking pot or dressed in weird costumes or getting into confrontation with the media. And it doesn't always reflect well on the movement in the public eye. And yet that, I have an open verdict on that. I don't know which approach is more effective. Because when you do try to really play up this image of civility, that also limits the course of action you can take. And that dynamic actually played itself out in the Sunflower Movement between the conflict between some of the groups in the movement. Some which did want a more bohemian or confrontational style of politics, such as the Untouchable Liberation Area versus the leadership in the legislative rim. And with the current set of movements that we see, the Bluebird movement, it's also still the civility aspect that's much more present. The other groups that are more bohemian still show up from time to time, but not as often.
Given that Taiwan still has these large-scale political movements and these big demonstrations, is there a political reality in Taiwan that just remains unchanged?
I think what's interesting is that a lot has actually remained the same. And so we're seeing a recurrence of ideas that came up 10 years ago and were rejected, such as the Cross-Strait Services Trade Agreement. When that was introduced as an idea in the last election cycle, it was quite strange to me that the KMT was still talking about this after seeing such a massive protest a decade earlier, or that they would push through bills as they are doing currently, because you look at 10 years ago and that provoked the public in such an extreme way. And so the more things change, the more they stay the same, and so I would say.
The book explores, the main character in the book storms Taiwan's executive yuan as part of the protest, which was your own personal experience as well. And in the book, it talks about the motivations or the decision-making to join this. If you remember back to that time when you chose to be part of that movement and to do that, what some would call drastic action, do you think the change that you wanted to see then has occurred in Taiwan?
I think so. And I think the thing that people forget is that the verdict on the movement changed very much over time. People forget that the movement was still denigrated in many ways until after Taiwan, but even more recently in the current election cycle do people talk about so openly being former sunflower activists. People just kind of knew that about them, but they didn't emphasize it as much. The executive branch, too, was originally viewed as unjustified by the public for many years. And it was only much later that that is viewed as an act of police violence. And I think people forget how long it actually took for that to occur, for that change in historical verdict on the movement or the various events in the movement to actually shift. And so I think in that way, actually, it's surprised me to a great extent that it has.
Yeah, and on that note, the two of the main themes of the book are kind of this hopelessness or futileness of existence alongside kind of a belief in a better world and affecting change. Now looking back at what you did then and what you've seen over the last 10 years, do you feel hopeful or do you feel that life is futile?
Not really. I think I'm still pretty hopeless in that sense. And I think what's interesting, particularly for me, a moment was 2019, which is 5 years after Sunflower, 5 years before the present. And it was basically going and seeing the insane level of desperation of, for example, high schoolers or middle school students in Hong Kong. And so I feel like I've seen this in so many contexts now, and just it is always this sense of hopelessness, but also wanting something better. And it's still often desperation that pushes people into very drastic courses of action that may bring about social change, but may not. And I think the verdict is still out on all of us in that sense. And so I feel it's kind of about the same, just maybe there's less angstiness about it 10 years later compared to when I was in my early 20s.
Looking back at your time as both an activist and a journalist, is there anything you would have done differently?
I think part of the novel really deals with emotional outbursts in activism. And I think that is something that maybe when I look back, I could have done better there in terms of emotional regulation. But then I look at every group, basically, and people in their early 20s, and we're just getting to all these arguments in the midst of the movement. And I think that's one of the things I think about even now. Just, for example, were there ways to have gone about certain decisions in the process of forming this publication or becoming a journalist or activist that could have gone differently? Maybe I could have done things better or not freaked out at this person at that moment and so forth. And that's something I think you always wondered about. And I think what's interesting, particularly in activism, particularly seeing the same group of people active for the same 10 years in activism and electoral politics and as public figures, is that the same grudges, actually, emotional outbursts and fighting from when we were young and then in the movement to later on electoral politics. That actually still persists in some way. And we still see the effects of this playing out now at the very national stage in electoral politics, actually. And I think what's interesting is looking at Taiwanese politics, actually. For example, there are politicians who were activists 20, 30 years ago, and their grudges are still present in the legislature today.
Well, with that, thank you, Brian, for joining us on the show today and for sharing your experiences both in your book and with us today.
Thank you.
This has been Zoom In, Zoom Out. For more stories from TaiwanPlus News, follow us on social media. I've been Rik Glauert. Take care, and we will see you next time.